see it as a service.
Yes.
The rest of the congregation sees it as a service.
Communion is a service.
Because it definitely is. Whether she sees it as such or not is irrelevant.
Yes. All right, so we're jumping into the third section of church history tonight. We broke church history up into 400-year sections roughly, and we'll have 2 more in the next 2 weeks. Take Mother's Day off, and then we have graduation on the 17th. We'll plan out the festivities of that day a little bit more thoroughly, a little closer too. So, when we left off last week, we're tracing the strands of the church through history, and it was a tumultuous 400 years between 400 and 800. Testing out a new organization system here tonight, so at the end of it we'll reflect on whether this is better organized for remembering and retaining information or not. We have 5 different strands of the church as of 800 AD. You've got the vibrant Celtic church, which has begun its decline, but very much in force in the British Isles and even across mainland Europe, especially in the western parts of Europe, France and Germany and Switzerland. You've got the Western Church, which includes Rome and Constantinople, because they haven't schismed yet, but those are very much very different power centers within the Western Church. You have the Pilgrim Church, which was starting in Turkey with the Paulicians.
That's funny.
And
Pilgrims in Turkey.
yes, pilgrims in Turkey. And we're kind of working from west to east, and so we have the Oriental Orthodox Church, not to be confused with the Eastern Orthodox Church, and there's 4 different centers of this: Armenia and Syria, based out of Antioch, Alexandria in Egypt, and the Ethiopian Orthodox Church was very strongly connected and subservient to the Coptic Church in Egypt. They always related to the Patriarch in Alexandria until just in the last century. So those 2 are very connected. And then further east yet, you have the Church of the East, which was found in Persia, China, and India. Hey, Brett.
Hello.
You just dropped that off there.
It's okay?
Yep, that'll work right there.
Thank you. You guys
Yep.
have a good night.
You too.
Yeah.
So we'll look first at the strand of the Celtic Church. So right around 800, the Celtic Church had another force against it that was novel and new. The Vikings from the Norse lands were starting to attack. 793, the monastery at Lindisfarne was attacked first, and that was when the Viking realm and the British Isles first came into contact. And then this was a regular occurrence. The Vikings raided Iona, which you remember is the center of missions and the base of operations for the Celtic Church. And they attacked in 795, 802, 806 was particularly devastating because they killed lots of monks that particular year. It wasn't completely depopulated. They attacked again in 825, 878, and then yet again 100 years later in 986. Interesting thing is that the Vikings were drawn to the wealth that was stored and hoarded at the monasteries. And so even though the Celtic Church was not organized with the Roman Church, they still had fairly wealthy monasteries that they were operating, and these were targets that the Vikings were after. There's lots of other Viking raids that were done, but the other thing that began at this time is that as the Roman Church was moving north and asserting its dominance, monasteries were shifting away from the Celtic traditions that Columba had set up and shifting over to the Benedictine traditions. And so that was something that didn't happen all at once, but one by one over the course of 400 years, largely shifted every single monastery over to a different operating protocol. 1069, the Celtic Church ends up getting abolished in Scotland by the king, and then about 100 years later, in the 1870s, the church in Ireland itself submitted to Rome. In the 1170s. There was an Anglo-Norman invasion of Ireland. That was 100 years after the Norman conquest of England, and the Roman Catholic Church sanctioned that invasion because they wanted to bring the Irish Church to heel, and so they gave religious cover for the invasion. So the Irish bishops, realizing what was happening, kind of had to adopt to the new political realities. And the Celtic Church at this point was just on the margins of Ireland and Scotland in the very remote rural areas. It was a heavily suppressed tradition of the church. So that strand kind of gets absorbed by the Roman Catholic Church. You have a lot of the leaders of that church that become Catholic saints. I'm not sure if the Celtic Church had a tradition of sainthood or not, but we see that pretty much wrapping up in this 400-year period. Over the same period of time, we have the Western Church. It has lots of significant events taking place. One happens actually right at the very opening of this period, and that Christmas Day of 800, Pope Leo III crowns Charlemagne as the Holy Roman Emperor. And the significance of this event is that it implies that the Pope has the authority to appoint rulers here on this earth. And so it asserts the authority of the church over the political authority of the kingdoms of Western Europe under the influence of the Roman Catholic Church. And this persists for a particularly long time. You know, the Western Church was sending missions out across Europe, and so the gospel and the message of the gospel gets to Sweden in 830. It goes to Moravia. Now, this is not from the west, this is coming from Constantinople, but it goes to Moravia with Cyril, and he was known specifically for creating the Cyrillic alphabet. And one of the reasons why he was so successful at reaching out to the Slavs is because he translated portions of the Bible into their language and gave them an alphabet they could read it in. And they all of a sudden were able to hear and see and read the word in their own language, which over and over again throughout history has always been a strong point at trying to reach an unreached people group, is getting the word of God into their language so that it sounds like it's real to them. In the next century, you have the gospel getting up to Norway and Poland. And in all these countries, this date is kind of the initial entry point when the first missionary would arrive and successfully survive and stick around, because there are plenty that arrived and died because Vikings and Norsemen are dangerous. But it usually took 200 or 300 years for the gospel message and the church to really influence society and culture to the point where an entire kingdom was considered Christian. And so in Norway especially, it was about 100 years later that Olaf was instrumental in seeing a larger swath of Norway become Christian. And of course, this is under the Roman Catholic tradition, and some of the Christianization efforts included forced baptisms and such. The Eastern Orthodox Church was also guilty of that practice. The Duchy of Moscow wanted to convert to Christianity, and so the story is the Tsar converted, and then he had all of his peasants thrown into the river to baptize them. So once they'd been thrown into the river, they were officially Christians, and the peasants didn't have any choice in the matter. So that is not perhaps the most effective of a missionary tactic. The peasants didn't really change their religious ways after being thrown into the river, but it was Tsar's idea. So now in the middle of this period, we have the famous schism, which is the Great Schism between the Roman Catholic Church and the Eastern Orthodox Church. And as we learned last week, this was not the first large schism. This is just the best known in the West, because the Eastern Orthodox Church continued to interact very heavily with the Roman Catholic Church as they were neighbors, and all the Oriental Orthodox churches faded from memory and were not interacting with Western churches hardly at all. So this takes place in 1054, and it was developing over a few hundred years. And what you end up with is the Roman Catholic Church being preeminent in Western Europe, celebrating with a Latin Mass, and this was led at the time by Pope Leo IX. And the Eastern Orthodox Church at the time was led by Patriarch Michael I, and it was largely found within the Byzantine Empire, and they did things in Greek. And but it's also found actually in Russia and Ukraine, although they hadn't gotten far into Ukraine at this point in time yet. Let's see, I have a couple of these out of order, it looks like. Jump over here. One of the issues that caused the Great Schism is that the patriarchs in Constantinople and the Eastern Church in general just did not ascribe to the idea of papal infallibility, and they also did not like the idea of papal primacy. And this was something that had been taught in Rome for about 400 years at this point in time. The Eastern Orthodox Church just finally said enough is enough. They were willing to give primacy of honor to the Pope in Rome because that was where Peter was said to have been the leader in the church when he was crucified. But they were not willing to grant him primacy in leadership over the entirety of the church, nor grant him infallibility in his ideas and decisions. Now, there were a host of other theological differences, most of which are hard for us to comprehend in this day and age, but they were the hot button issues of the day.
What, like icons?
That was part of it. They have a different approach to that, but also how you describe the Holy Spirit and where he came from is another one, and a few other things that they generally just disagree with. Part of it, honestly, is the difference in the way you render words between Greek and Latin, and that's something we should keep in mind as we're assessing church differences in doctrine, is how much of this is driven just simply by language and miscommunication. That was not an insignificant thing. At the time, there was no shortage of people that were willing to allow for the differences that were there and realize that this might just be a different way of articulating roughly the same idea, but when you're getting the political pressures of control and authority, theological differences become all the more strong and used as an excuse to divide and schism. Now, the Western Church is not doing well everywhere. One of the things I wanted to point out is that North Africa, particularly Algeria and Tunisia today, it used to be a very strong center of the church in the first 400 years, and that's where Augustine of Hippo was based out of. That's where they decided the canon of the New Testament. That area went into pretty serious decline after the Arab conquest, and this is mostly because the caliphates were just generally quite oppressive to the Christians. There was the heavy taxation for being a Christian, and then there was also the convert or die practices that were employed by some of the leaders of the caliphates, not all of them obviously. But when this was sustained for a solid 600 years, the number of Christians just diminished over time. And so at 660 roughly, when the Arab conquest went through North Africa, there had been 400 Roman Catholic bishoprics, which is an enormous number of churches presided over by a bishop in a relatively small area geographically. Like today, I think the Roman Catholic Church only has about 1,800 bishops, and that's not that many more spread across the entire planet as you have 400 in North Africa alone. By the 1300s, there were only 4 bishoprics left, and so that is just a steady decline in oppression. And eventually, the Roman Catholic Church just could not find any believers, could not find any churches down there. It was just too difficult and to maintain the faith and survive, much less be able to disciple and win over people to your faith in the midst of that kind of oppression. Now, the relationship between Islam and Christianity went both directions in very negative ways. And jumping over here, this is the time frame when the Western Church was asserting itself, particularly the Roman Catholic Church, but the Eastern Orthodox Church was complicit in some of these too with the Crusades. So before 1200 AD, we have 3 Crusades, and they're announced by the Pope, which gives you an idea of their influence over society. And after being announced, then lots of kings in Western Europe and dukes and other people would rally large armies, march or sail over to the Middle East. And the first one was the most successful one, perhaps, as far as geography and conquest goes. This one had the support of the Byzantine emperor, which was probably a good part of it. They conquered Jerusalem and Antioch, and they actually pushed into the Euphrates River Valley and conquered, and so they set up three crusader states, one out of Jerusalem, one out of Antioch, and one out of Edessa. And the caliphate was pushed back, and so then all of a sudden you're inserting Roman Catholic Christians into areas that had previously been only populated by the Syrian Orthodox Church, one of those Oriental Orthodox churches. So then you end up with an interesting interaction between those two, which we'll come back to. So the First Crusade is at 1096 to 1099. The Second Crusade comes about 50 years later. This one's announced by Pope Eugene III. What had happened is the easternmost of those three kingdoms, Edessa, fell to the caliphate again. And so he declared a new crusade. He included the Iberian Peninsula in the crusade. And so this rallied a bunch of troops into Spain, and they were able to reconquer a chunk of Portugal. And Lisbon in particular fell to the west. And in the east, they were not able to reclaim Edessa, and so they didn't actually regain the territory that initially sparked that crusade. Third Crusade gets announced by Pope Urban III. That one fails to recapture Jerusalem, which had fallen to Saladin in 1187. And the reason I bring this up is because this is a very unique period in church history where the church is actually asserting political authority over kings and kingdoms and influencing world affairs at a level that is not seen today, has not been seen since, where you've got intercontinental military campaigns being launched by a leader of a church. It's kind of unique in church history, and it strained a lot of the relationship between Muslim societies and Christian societies, but it led to all kinds of other things later on too. So we'll close the Western Church strand there and shift over to the Pilgrim Church, as the Pilgrim Church actually starts moving westward in this period of time. They were the Paulicians, and they were in eastern Turkey, and so they were actually really close to where the Crusader states went in, but before that even happened, the Byzantine Emperor in 970 AD relocated 200,000 of them to the other side of his empire. So he moved them from his eastern frontier, where they were next to Muslims, and pushed them all the way into Bulgaria, which is a country in Europe to the north of Constantinople. Here they get renamed because they're surrounded by Slavic people. They switch to the native language, and so they get called Bogomils, which in Slavic means either friends of God or dear to God. And of course the Byzantines are Eastern Orthodox, and they heavily persecute these Paulicians in Bulgaria as well. And the contemporary reports from the Eastern Orthodox church leaders who were trying to stamp them out, so they called them worse than demons, but at the same time they recognized that they actually lived more righteously than all their neighbors. And so in spite of the fact that they were condemned and persecuted as being horrible, awful Satanists and things of the sort, they actually lived at a more righteous standard than the Eastern Orthodox Church commoners did. And that did take a little bit to notice in the Eastern Orthodox Church. Because of the persecution, though, they actually spread to the west, away from Constantinople, and they push into the Balkans, into Serbia and Bosnia. And then a really odd thing takes place right at the end of this 400-year period with the Pilgrim Church. In 1199, the leader of Bosnia is a guy by the name of Kulan, and Ban is the title of the ruler of Bosnia. But all of a sudden the Roman Catholic Pope in Rome is lamenting that Kulan Ban is actually a Bogomil, and most of the Bosnians are Bogomils. There's a solid 10,000 of them. And this was so prevalent, actually, they determined that Bosnia actually ceased to be Roman Catholic. And so it was a Bogomil or Paulician or non-denominational church that was all across the country. And the interesting thing is that it was not state driven, it was conversion driven, and that it was just the entirety of or a large portion of the population that had actually converted over. And this also coincides with the golden age of Bosnia. To this day, they reflect back and remember that time under Kulan Ban, which was the most peaceful and prosperous time that Bosnia has ever had. And even recently, Bosnia has not been particularly peaceful or prosperous. It is a impoverished, war-torn backwater of Europe today. And one of the things they taught and embraced as a country was the priesthood of all believers, which abolished the Roman Catholic priesthood in this area, and the churches were led by elders. They didn't call them priests, and they would have an overseer who was usually a grandfather figure in the church who was the leader. And very similar to a lot of churches today where they have elders and a pastor leading the church. So this is an interesting point in the history of the Pilgrim Church, but there's a direct geographic connection and theological connection that goes back to the rise of the Paulicians about 450, 600 years earlier. And it continues, we'll find out next week, marching west across Europe and influencing all kinds of areas that were traditionally Roman Catholic. Shifting to another strand, though, we have the Oriental Orthodox churches. 3 of them, remember it's all the A's. We have Armenia, Alexandria in Egypt, and Antioch in Syria. So the Coptic Church in Egypt, like the Roman Catholic Church in Western North Africa, is also heavily oppressed by the caliphates. And so it's really hard to convert people when it's like giving up your economic freedom, security, and having to pay double taxes, plus nobody likes you, and they might try to convert you by the sword again. So in spite of this, they persisted where the Roman Catholic Church just about entirely dried up. It was still an existing and organized church in Egypt, complete with monasteries off in the desert. And it did not succumb to the pressures that the Muslims put on the Coptic Church. And so that's something that should be noted, especially relative to the experience of the Roman Catholic Church just a little bit further to the west. Now the Syriac Orthodox Church, another one of the Oriental Orthodox churches, it has a really hard time, but it goes back and forth because it's in the middle of a war zone during the Crusades. So they're in Syria, Antioch and Edessa is their homeland, and they get invaded by the Arabs, and so then they're oppressed by the caliphates and taxed heavily. The Crusades, in theory, liberate them, but then the Roman Catholic Crusaders realize that these are not Roman Catholic Christians, and so they are heavily subjugated and oppressed by the Roman Catholic Crusaders. And so that flip-flop then cost them, and then they actually almost died out entirely by the 11th century. It was limited back down to just a couple bishoprics in Antioch proper, and they retreated back to a monastery in the middle of nowhere. And as the wars were going back and forth, and you had the Eastern Orthodox churches from the Byzantine Empire trying to push in, and the Roman Catholic churches from the Crusader states trying to push in, they just had a really hard time trying to manage in the middle of it, and they had Muslims fighting amongst them, which would also subjugate or cause them difficulties. But it did not die out, and it was still in existence at the end, or at 1200 AD. Now, shifting over to a couple other branches, the Armenian Apostolic Church was actually trying to reunite with the Eastern Orthodox Church throughout this period. They were sending emissaries and church councils back and forth between Constantinople and the head in Armenia, trying to reconcile the theological differences that had caused the original split and schism. All of these efforts, and there was 5, 6, or 7 of these over a 400-year period, ended up failing to rectify the union between the two churches. But that was what the Armenian Apostolic Church was trying to do throughout this period. One of the other things that happened is Armenia itself actually fell to the Muslim conquests, and so the church within Armenia became a ethnic and cultural center of the culture of the Armenians, but they were actually ruled by Muslims at this point in time. Now the Ethiopian Orthodox Church has a unique story. because when the Arab conquest pushed through, they went across Egypt, but they did not get up the Nile River Valley as far as Ethiopia. And so at that time, the kingdom down there was Aksum, and they had been an empire that stretched back into the Roman period, and it fell as an empire in 960 AD. And it was almost 200 years before another strong political entity arose, and the Ethiopian Orthodox Church survived the chaos of that dark ages down in Ethiopia. So this would be a period of chaos that would be comparable to, when the Germanic tribes overran the Western Roman Empire, and Vandals invaded North Africa, and all the civil society supported by the empire just fell completely into disrepair and failed to function, and you had tribes and warlords fighting back and forth. So the Ethiopian Orthodox Church didn't die in the midst of all this chaos. It actually persisted. It was heavily isolated at this point in time, though, too. In fact, the Roman Catholic Church and the Eastern Orthodox Church did not even know that the Zagwe dynasty existed when it came back into being, and so the Ethiopian Church down there was very, very isolated from everything else that was happening. They did relate, though, continually with the Coptic Church, and the patriarch who was in Alexandria was always sending a leader down to be the head of the Ethiopian Orthodox Church. And they maintained that relationship for nearly 2,000 years. It's a recent development that they actually went autonomous from each other by mutual agreement, I believe. But we'll get to that in a couple lessons. The political chaos probably didn't create a conducive environment for any missions or spreading out, and that was something that is not characteristic of the Ethiopian Orthodox Church in this period of time, or pretty much any time. They just stayed in Ethiopia. So we've gone through the Celtic Church, the Western Church, the Eastern Orthodox Church, all the branches of the Oriental Orthodox churches. We'll get to our last strand here, the Church of the East, which is much further east than the Eastern Orthodox Church. And the Church of the East, if you remember, was centered in the area of Persia. The patriarch was in Seleucia Ctesiphon, if I'm pronouncing that city correctly, which at this point in time is under a caliphate. But the Church of the East held up under the caliphate over there much better than Western areas did. And in 800 AD, even though they were under Muslim rule, they expanded north and started sending bishops and missionaries up into Armenia and Azerbaijan. And so you start seeing some overlap amongst the different church and faith traditions at this point in time. And they're starting to mix up, especially in the Middle East. Now, way over in China, in the far eastern stretch of the Eastern Church, you have the ruler in the Tang Dynasty, Wu Zong, who for 6 years reversed the Tang policy of religious tolerance and especially of foreign religions. And something prompted him to suppress all foreign influence. I believe it was more driven by the Buddhist missionaries coming out of India than it was actually the Christians, but they were all lumped together. Any foreign religion was suppressed for about a 6 or 7 year period of time. And this actually exposed one of the weaknesses of the Church of the East, is that their organization didn't train up local leaders in the church as in China. All the archbishops and the metropolitans and the higher up leaders of the church were always being sent over from Persia or the Silk Road kingdoms in Central Asia. So the names of all the archbishops and metropolitans over in China were always foreigners and not actually ethnic Chinese. And they would have some lower level leaders in the church that were ethnic Chinese, and there are Han Chinese names that are associated with Christian cemeteries, but they were not in the top echelons of the church. And this becomes a weakness in the Church of the East, because when the Tang Dynasty ultimately falls, which was in 907, China disintegrates into 53 years of chaos and war, And the Church of the East is no longer able to send leaders over to these archbishoprics and over into China. And systematically, the church essentially disintegrates. And in 960, the Song dynasty arises in China, and they ruled for about the next 300 years to 1279, but it didn't support the church like the Tang dynasty had. And so, whereas the Tang dynasty supported all of these different churches with their bishops and archbishops and metropolitans and all the monasteries as well, the Song dynasty was not supportive of this, and Christianity nearly vanished in China in this period of time. Strangely enough, it persisted in Mongolia to the north of China, which we'll look into a little bit more next week, but it did not hold up well in imperial China. And I would attribute that to their lack of developing local leaders and a local expression. I think they were still doing church in Aramaic, perhaps, which is not conducive to reaching the local population. But the leadership of the church was heavily dependent on maintaining a safe passage from Persia all the way across the Silk Road into China, and that was not something that always stayed the same. And there was several periods that would last a couple generations long where it was just in political turmoil. This isn't everywhere, though. It did persist quite well in Persia, India, and Sri Lanka. However, during the last couple hundred years of here, there was a general decline of the Church of the East, which can be measured just in the number of bishoprics that the church claimed to have. So whereas there were 68 bishoprics in the Church of the East at about the year 1000, and this is after most of the Chinese ones were gone, over the next 200 years, that declined in number down to about 24. And these would be the ones left in Persia, the Malabar coast of India, where they still persisted, and there may have been one or two in Sri Lanka as well, off the southern tip. The ones in Sri Lanka were always catering mostly to travelers and tradesmen, not the locals. So that was not a strong church Christian presence there. But at the end of this 400-year period of time, we still have 5 strands of the church. The Celtic Church has largely been assumed into the Roman Catholic Church. There are a few small outlying islands that still practice the traditions in a very hidden fashion. But you have the Roman Catholic Church in the west, the Eastern Orthodox Church in the Byzantine Empire and some of the Slavic lands. In the middle of those, you've got the Pilgrim Church, which is like a non-denominational church movement going on, and was not able to get stamped out. It was pervasive. Then you also have the Oriental Orthodox churches, which are largely existing in Muslim territories, although Ethiopia is far enough south, they were actually south of the Muslim expansion. And then in the east, you still have the Church of the East, although it has experienced some bumps in the road along the way. Next week, we'll see what starts happening in the next 400-year period. 1200 to 1600 has lots of world history taking place and lots of changes happen.